Welcome to the Backpick Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Thomas. Today's our first return guest, Brandon Oliver. We dove even deeper this time, so we're actually got a two-parter here for you. Today, part one, we talk a lot about throwing and the different positions that we get to from different stances. I think you guys are really going to enjoy it. The Backpick Podcast and the Catching Academy are happy to be partnered with All Star Sports, who we think does the best job of taking care of catchers. You can go to their website and use our code CatchingAcademy10 and get 10% off anything site-wide. So the first ever returner to the podcast today, Brandon Oliver. And the biggest reason was I think you and I are in the, at least top 10 of catching nerds in the world. And we dove down some paths. I think we spent about 40 minutes on the pre-pitch move. So get a chance to talk about a few more different things. Talk to me a little bit. I think one of the biggest things, and it's interesting because all the levels are changing. Now we're seeing college baseball's on, and I'm seeing a lot of, different stances, not good in a lot of scenarios. Not a ton of balance in a lot of them. Talk a little bit about stances and how that's kind of even kind of going further. We know that everybody's going to one knee, but there's a lot of people that are starting to transition in stances. Talk a little bit about what you're seeing.
Yeah, I think there's been a huge evolution in kind of what we're seeing out of the setups and positions that guys are getting into. I think for the most part, it's a great thing to see guys exploring and trying new things. And I think we've kind of broke the mold of maybe in 2018, 2019, everybody's saying like, oh, look at how Mitch Garver does it. Like, this is how we all have to do it. And so we see some guys doing some different things now and trusting some different positions that maybe we didn't used to. We didn't used to think that you could block out of this spot or throw from here. I know specifically in the last couple of years, like the whole left knee down throwing thing, like we solved that puzzle pretty quick. There's a lot of guys that have done that really consistently, especially at the higher levels. So I think for the most part, the intentions are really good. But like you and I have talked about before, I still think that when you're trying to find what's comfortable and what's best for an athlete, there's still a lot of people out there that I think are missing some of the key points maybe of why a certain stance is advantageous, why a certain stance would be better for you in this situation versus this one. And I think what we go to for guys generally is like, hey, let's find out what's comfortable. What's comfortable isn't always what's optimal. And there's definitely a way to take a kid into a certain position and, get him comfortable with it over time, or get to a foundation of where we need to be. Like, where can we put force into the ground? How can we get our spikes in the ground? How can we create good angles early with our hips so that we create good angles when we go to block? There's some little nuanced things there that I think if we start with that, then maybe the answer, shows itself in time. But I seem to see a lot of guys that are just getting back there and they're getting wherever's comfortable. And sometimes what's comfortable doesn't put you in a good spot to move in the next 10th of a second,
I think the left knee down is a good example of that because like everybody goes to left knee down first, right? Like the minute you're like, all right, let's try a knee down, they all feel comfortable left knee down. And then you'll start to see them where they're like sliding, they can't really hold their self. And I'm like, try right knee down. And then they're like right knee and they're like stable and like able to keep their hips nice and square. Like everything is good. And honestly, like I've been meaning to ask somebody because I'm like, what I want to know, like we have a PT down the street. I mean to ask him like, what is that? Like when it, like what actual like part of your body? I know it's obviously got mostly to do with the hips, but I'm like, I kind of want to learn more about it. But it's interesting because then it's like they get right knee down, which they're like, oh man, this feels weird. And then they're just like ripping off the machine, just boom, 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 because their body's stable and they're able to move the gloves so well. So how do you kind of approach pushing guys a little bit to get uncomfortable?
Man, it's definitely been an interesting evolution on my part for sure. Even in my later playing days, as we start to see some of this stuff come to the surface a little bit. You started to see a couple guys at the higher levels that were doing it. So I know at the end of my career, I was definitely utilizing a lot of one knee setups, and probably for me with my hip mobility, that made a lot of sense for me. But I was very, very biased towards right knee down. Loved right knee down. I was one of the few guys. I don't know if I ever caught a pitch in my life left knee down. But when I went to coaching, I kind of took that into it, right? It's like, oh, well, right knee down makes the most sense because that's what worked for me. And that's what you see out of a lot of the guys that are doing it at this point in time. And it definitely took me a couple years to change that approach and to be a little more open to guys who wanted to use some different left knee down variations. And I think the funny thing is, kind of to your point, you end up seeing most guys work out of that. They'll pick left knee down because, hey, that's what's comfortable, or maybe that's all a variation of all they've ever done is left knee down. And we've seen quite a few guys that come back, whether it's a month later or a year later, and they're like, yeah, dude, I don't use that anymore. Like I've started using right knee down way more. And again, to your point, from an anatomical standpoint, I don't know why that seems to make more sense for guys. But I would definitely say for a majority of them, that's kind of what it is. So what we do now is we kind of go through that process. And I think there's a ton of value in training both and balancing your body in that way. So we definitely don't like guys getting in there, right knee down for every pitch of every session they're going to catch in here. But, we want them to understand when the game's on the line and you got to go win a pitch and you got to put yourself in a position to help your team. Hopefully we know where that's at.
And prioritizing, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing. Like, oh, I can't do that here, and I can't do this when I'm in this stance. It's like, well, like you do something really well. So, like, if that's the priority, like that's the stance we have to be in, and we kind of got to figure out the rest from there. And there's just too many times where, like, guys, and I think you're right about the evolution of the left knee down and throwing in the left knee down, because so many guys are like, I can't throw from there, and I'm like, would you just go back there and throw a few? Like, it's not even like a mechanical thing, or like, it's like, just do it and like see what happens. And all of a sudden they're like, some of these guys who have really good ability to move their weight and get their hips up and like just can even just feel like it's like a flow state of right left boom from a left knee down. They're like, oh yeah, it's like, I'm like, dude, I don't have an answer. Like, I'm not going to sit here and be like, this is how you throw from left knee down. Like, let's go do it. Then they do it and they're like, I had one kid send me a video and he's like, yeah, I haven't really been able to throw left knee down much. And then like in a game, like he's like, I was left knee down because I didn't think this guy was going to run. And then all of a sudden, like, boom, gets up, bam, like perfect long hop, got the ball out front in a hurry. And I was like, dude, just, you're an athlete, bro. Just be an athlete. Yeah. So what, talk about that. I really want to get into some throwing today, because I know we didn't get into it much last time you're on. Mm-hmm. Talk about how you're training throwing, again, from the stance. Are you having guys adjust into a 2-foot stance on the runner call, like anything like that? Talk a little bit about that pre-pitch sort of a deal for throwing, just as much as we dove into the receiving piece.
Yeah, I think, for us, it really starts with kind of some of those nuances and things with the setup that I alluded to earlier. I think a lot of guys struggle out of the left knee down because their left foot maybe isn't in the ground the way that it should be from the beginning, or they're just sitting on the top of their shoelaces there with that left foot. And really it's, for us, the left leg is what pushes us up, right? Because we're trying to get the right foot down into the ground as fast as possible, whether we're, replacing feet a little bit or it's a jab step, whatever space we have. So whether a kid is right knee down, left knee down, for some guys, they want to start on 2 feet and work into a knee down if the guy doesn't go. Whatever it is, we want to make sure that our feet are in the right spot and that our connection with our spikes is in the right spot, so that if we do have to go transition or make a move, we're going to be in a better position to do that. And so we tend to stay away from like balance and using that verbiage, because balanced is comfortable, but balance doesn't mean that you're going to be adjustable, right? We want to be activated. We want to be engaged. We want to be, just really strong with that foundation. And so from there, I think you have a lot of guys that can do a number of different things. For me personally, I probably have more of a bias towards if a kid wants to throw off 2 feet, well, then let's just start on 2 feet. We got a million ways that we can get into our knee down setup should he not run. I know we're seeing a lot of guys have success with starting on a knee and then kind of that like late hop to 2 feet if they need to. Um, we definitely have a handful of guys here that prefer to do it that way. We don't tell them that they can't. But generally, when we go through the kind of the Rolodex of options for how we can transition into different positions and what would make the most sense over the course of a 150 pitch game and different scenarios, we tend to see guys probably move away from the whole start on a knee and hop up to 2 feet if I have to throw kind of thing. So I think
It takes a good athlete to do that.
it
There's a
really
lot
does.
of times I'm like, hey, like just try to pop up, and then I'm like,
Yeah.
like I'm pretty mobile, so I'm like, no, just kind of like this, and I like do it, and they're like, oh, okay, and then like all of a sudden they like stand all the way up to come all the way back down. I was like, no, 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 no. We're gonna scrap this right now.
That might be where we're different because I've tried to do it and I'm not mobile. How does anybody do this, you know? Um, but yeah, you just got to know your guy, and I really think that it starts with just having those options for him, right? Like, hey, if you want to start here, we can then get to this throwing position, maybe these 3 or 4 different ways, or at least use that as a foundation of where we start. If you want to start with this knee down, we can do it this way. If you want to start on 2 feet, here's your list of options. And we'll take the time to go through all of those. Usually there's going to be a very small list of transitions and setups that they end up rolling with and want to use in game. But we'll go through tons of variations to get them to understand just how many ways there is to do it.
And I go back and forth on the idea. Like I know, like the logical thinking is that like we have to defend the runner first, right? Because obviously they're going to run before anything else. So kind of that old idea, not old idea, but like the idea that like we start, in kind of like a sprinter stance, and then like runner doesn't go, we might kick out or at least open up and just square our chest a little bit more. Makes sense. But I started getting guys where I would do the opposite, and I'd be like, where do you receive and block best? And then it'd be like, all right, if they run, let's move into the sprinter stance, because then, it became like we have time to make that little kind of, we always kind of used to call it like a cheat, that like turn early. So like a step back into that sprinter stance kind of creates that turn and some momentum to that. But I think from a like a critical thinking point, it's like go from 2 processes to 1 instead of 1 to 2. I think that's the part where I struggled, was like, oh, is he running? No, he's not running. Okay, kick out. Now receive or block. And it's like, I just feel like that like thought process got so many guys like panicked on what was happening as they were moving into that position. So I think to your point is just like, we got to have multiple ways that we can do this.
Yeah. And what you touched on, I think, is actually a huge deciding factor for kids. I remember I saw that first, I think, with Swanee and some of the later work that they were doing when Gary Sanchez was still there. They went from like, hey, why are we kicking out every pitch, to just starting there, and if they do run, we can kick it back. And to your point, like from an ecological standpoint, that makes way more sense. That's way less we have to do. More often than not, the guy's not running. And so I remember we immediately started taking that into some of the stuff we were doing with our catchers. And what we found was that it actually didn't help as many as I had hoped, because so many guys relied on kind of the rhythm and the timing of like that leg kick or that step or whatever it was matching up with their pre-pitch. And so then we kind of had to take a step back and be like, okay, this is probably that fork in the road where we're going to have to really understand each athlete. Like, hey, are you a guy that needs that rhythm and you like setting up that late or making that move that late? Cool, we can keep it going down this direction. If you're a guy that doesn't need that, like, boom, here's an entirely new option for you that might make way more sense, right? So again, just knowing your guys and yeah, it is different for most of them, for sure.
I know a lot of times we just throw them back there and kind of see what happens. But if you were to talk about kind of that cheat or that early move from left knee down? What are you talking to guys there? That's the one where like it's easy right knee down to just kind of feel that same feel of like the left knee cheats, just like we used to do with 2 feet, and the
Yeah.
right knee comes off the ground. But from left knee down, it's really hard to kind of feel the back hip engage.
Yeah. So I definitely probably cold take here on the catching community side with the cheat move. There was one video I watched. It was Contreras from 2020, and he was on 2 feet that year for at least most of the year, I believe. And he was a big like cheat guy, right? Like his knee would cave in, shoulder would turn. Anytime somebody was going, like he loved to throw. I think we all know that. And I watched this video of him throwing, and you see everything cheat in. And as the pitch is getting closer to him, you see everything actually just going right back to where it was, right? And I was like, oh, I wonder if that's just because he was super early with it, or maybe not on time. You watch a couple more videos, you kind of see the same thing. I go back to some like Yachty videos, and like Yachty used to talk about the cheat all the time. You can use clips right now. And once again, I just didn't see it happening the way that it had probably always been explained to us when we were catchers, and or even when we were coaching on early. It's like, oh yeah, we turn early. And so really what I saw from this collective group of catchers, was that it wasn't so much a turn, but it was really about getting like the left knee over the foot and kind of rolling yourself over your left foot. That is what would get the hips kind of turning. That is what would get them elevated, create space to get the right foot down. And so really what we started doing was kind of just focusing on that feel. Like, hey, can you get your knee over your toe, right? If we can get that and we can kind of roll the hips forward that way, we should be able to do what we need to do with the back foot. When it came to the left knee down, obviously that kind of push up through the left foot and getting a sense of like getting your left hip forward and getting over your left toe is difficult with where you start. So for us, it was really just about making sure that left foot that was back in the ground had some spikes there so that we still feel like we can push up off of our left foot. I think most guys struggle with that because the right foot is obviously the only one that has all its spikes in the ground, and they're trying to push up off their right foot while also trying to get their right foot down in the ground. Probably not going to work out too well. Whatever we can do from any stance to try to create that feel of getting the hips up and kind of over that left foot is really kind of the approach we take there, I guess.
Why do guys not throw from their knees more?
I would love to know the answer to that question.
So I work with a lot of girls, and like we work on, obviously like they're legit, like they won't throw from anything with their knees. All of them. By the time I get to them, get them feeling how to throw from their knees, I'm like, just do this all the time. There's no reason, right? Then I'm like, well, what's the difference between a 16-year-old girl on a 60-foot diamond and a big leaguer who can throw at 88 miles an hour on a 90-foot diamond? Like, why wouldn't he utilize that tool more?
I honestly, man, I've gone back and forth on this 100 times. I definitely think we should be throwing from our knees way more often. I think it would alleviate a lot of the transition issues and questions that guys are trying to sort out and like what's best for them. But I used to have this chart, and I could probably still pull it up, and you'll see the same thing with all the throwing data, even from recent years. But it was a couple years back, and it was, everybody's pop times in Major League Baseball. And, the top third of those guys that were like really elite throwers, great velo, great exchange times, right? Then you had this next set of guys who all kind of averaged the same. But even then, kind of the top half of that group, they did it with velo and not so much exchange time. And then below them, you had the guys with like elite exchange time, average velo. And we've been to CatcherCon, you've done podcasts, and you've talked to some of the best catching minds in baseball, and we've taken in all this information. And even still, we know that velo's king when it comes to throwing, right? Like, not every pitcher, not every organization is prioritizing how well a pitcher holds runners or being quick to the plate or anything like that. Like velo is king. So if we're working on velo with guys and we're seeing that more and more catchers are throwing with better and better velo, like if you want to go attack a low hanging fruit and you want to knock down some exchange time stuff, how about we just eliminate the footwork piece?
Yeah.
I think we've all seen that like there's clearly some potential advantages to exchange time if we're throwing from our knees. So I definitely like to see more guys do it and see what happens. And maybe it's just the stigma that we can't get away from. Because like you said, in softball, the stigma's flipped. You could probably
Totally.
have throwing successfully from their feet if we, really dove into it and took the time to understand. But they come in and they're like, oh no, we just throw from our knees. And you
Yeah.
talk to a baseball kid and it's like, oh, we throw from our feet. And there probably hasn't been much more thought behind it than that.
No. And the girls, it's like they get comfortable in a stance and like they're gonna figure out how to throw from. I mean, again, they don't have to throw far, but like it's just the idea of like if I had a couple girls where I'm like, I'd really love to see you do some more right knee down. Like, they get really comfortable left knee down and they
Yeah.
get really good receive block left knee down. I'm like, I'd love to see some right knee down. I think it's really going to help your throwing. And then like, again, they just find a way to get into that right hip from the left knee down and they rip. And I'm like, dude, like, you know, all good. Like if we're throwing people out. And I think the piece that people don't really understand about just rotation in general is that it happens in the middle of our body. Like if you're not following, Eugene Bleecker and 108 Performance talk about all this stuff, like they're amazing. But it's like the idea that like rotation is in the middle of our body. And so we're already starting with a good base of connecting to the ground because most of us are knee down now. So like
Yeah.
the feet were always like, we got to get connected to the ground and then we can turn, right? And it's like, well, we're really solidly connected to the ground on a knee down. Let's
Yeah.
figure out how to create the stretch across our body from there and then go, because that's the reality of where the speed comes from.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if there's anybody that'd be listening to this, I'm like, okay, so how do we know what's best for our athlete? Have them play horse, like have them play pig, like when they're going through their throwing stuff, like, hey, you already used that one. You already went right knee down sprinter stance, throw from your feet. Like we can't do that one again. So like, let's go left knee down, throw from your knees or whatever. And you make it competitive, you make it fun, and
I
you will
love that.
absolutely see dudes competing against each other, but also you're going to see them make a throw and they're going to see their velo or their exchange time on the hit tracks and go, whoa, I didn't know I could do that from that stance. I didn't know I could do that from my knees. So I know we do a little bit of that. Jackson, one of our catching guys, I think he actually brought that to us first. And we were like, absolutely, let's do that all the time, you know?
No, it's
So
incredible. I'm gonna definitely mixing that one in for sure. I
yeah,
love that. It's funny though, because the left knee down thing is the minute they gets comfortable there, like the first thing they'll say is like, I can't throw from there. And it's like, let's just do it, And again, I think, I had one kid yesterday come in and was like, I'm trying to figure out throwing left knee down to third. And I'm like, okay, like go, And it's like, all right, now he does it. And I'm like, all right, only thing is like, let's move back more than to third, just like feel like you're moving back to clear the space instead of to third. Okay, boom. Like body, self-organizes doing it. That's it. Like, and it was like, okay, done. Like, and I think kids today feel like they need all the steps. It's
hmm
like, how do I do this? And I'm like, let's do it. Like, let's see what you're doing instead of like, well, in order to throw from the left knee down, you start in this position. They want like a how-to video, and we just gotta pump them with it and do it.
yeah. I mean, I think that's the thing on a lot of amateur, I guess on the amateur side as a whole is like kids and parents more often than not, like they're just looking for corrections. They're not necessarily looking for coaching, like the amount of exploration and failure that should take place if we're truly like building a relationship and working with a kid and trying to get him to take some ownership over what's happening. Like that's what it's about. It's not just like, oh, hey, twist your foot, 45 degrees here, shift your weight a little bit. Okay, now do this with your back elbow. Like that's just grading the test. That's not really what we do to get kids smarter in a classroom. there's a little bit of learning that happens before we do that. So yeah,
Big
more,
fan of
more
exploration over explanation.
I love that.
Just let's
I
just like
haven't heard that yet, but it'll be on a futures t-shirt next week.
I'll send you my address. Send me one. But that's it, man. Like really, it's like, and we did a coaches clinic here for one of the little leagues, and I said, hey, I'm going to do this much different than you think. You know, like
Yeah.
you think it's going to be like we're going to get all the dads out here and be like, this is how you throw, and this is how you. It's not going to be like that. I did a whole hour presentation on being a coach, and I just took all these clips from the podcast of guys I had on, mostly like more mental guys than anything else, but just like the idea of like stop trying to teach them and start trying to train them, like be external, like, oh, he's throwing it high, tell him to throw it low. Like don't tell him how to throw. And obviously at that age it's amazing, like they need to do way more explanation, exploration between 8 and 12. But like it's crazy even at the older ages how many kids want to get so technical on things, and I'm like, stop. I need you to feel more than like know. I don't need you to know what it is that you're doing all the time. I need you to feel what it is that you're doing.
Yeah.
That's just like that to me is the feel is the most underrated thing in baseball to me.
I'd agree. I think kids are probably, since they're not pushed there from an early age, they don't even know what it's supposed to feel like to be in that, to prioritize that as they're going through their work. I think we can get to a point where, sometimes feels have a shelf life, and maybe that's where like the introduction of data and objective feedback and some of the other things can like bridge that gap a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But you're spot on. Like if the end goal is for an athlete to really understand where they need to be and how to get there, and once they are there, like we want them to take that level of ownership over their game and their development. They have to be feeling the whole thing. And it has to be day in and day out. Like, yes, I feel myself making this move, and it's backed up by this report that I'm getting as well. Like it is trending in the right direction. I am making this happen. So yeah, very much in agreement with you there for sure.
And just the feel versus real deal of like, like, I know, and I know Jerry posted a video on this. He's talking about how like the exchange, in the throw doesn't really happen like super close to the body. And I'm like, 100%. Like, obviously we don't want to be tight in here, but like, I literally can tell a kid to see how far he can let this get deep. And it almost never gets to here. They're so in a hurry. Right. So it's like the idea of like, he's breaking down like an absolute technical, like, hey, the exchange happens out in front, way more out in front than we think. Yes, but if I tell a kid to go out front, he's got zero chance of organizing his body at that point in time. So it's just the idea of like, that's why I love all the data and everything like that. Like when you think this or when you feel this, look at the data. Look, this is who you are, right? Not like when you move your hands and you do your thing and then you get into the slot and you do it. It's like, no, when you have that thought, like just when you have that thought, look at the objective data, So like creating more of the thought process and the feel.
Even if it's just video playback. I mean, there couldn't be a metric up there and you're just looking at video. Hey, you felt like you did this. This is what actually happened, right? Like if you, and this is something we try to like stay conscious of, but like, the whole dynamical systems theory on like how we acquire different motor patterns and things of that nature, like the input is not always proportionate to the output. Like more often than not, it's not going to be, right? So a kid feels this super exaggerated change, right? Like, man, I got so drastic with what I did there on the exchange. And then we watched the video and it got incrementally better, right? And then on the flip side of that incremental change gives us this huge change in production or output or whatever. So it's understanding for each kid just what that ratio is and how close their feel is to their real. We don't need it to match up by any means. Like it doesn't have to be the same. If you understand that, like, hey, I think this side of the spectrum and I end up getting the middle, that's great. If you think middle of the spectrum, that's exactly what you end up getting out of your movements, that's great too. But as long as there's something there to kind of bridge the gap, I think is probably the thing that we focused on the most. You know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The last piece of throwing I want to talk about is just like the release point.
Yes.
And this to me is like always something that's difficult. And again, because at younger ages, like they're not strong and they want to like move, feel like they got to move through the throw. And, you know, they got coaches telling them to gain ground and they, you know, everything. And so it's very difficult to get the ball out front when obviously our upper body is moving forward.
Sure.
What are some cues or some things that you do to try to help guys feel that? I mean, that's like, that to me is probably one of my favorite things in coaching is like when for the first time somebody feels like their left hip move like backwards to rotate and like the ball goes out front and that ball just kind of like jumps and they go like, what the hell just happened? You know what I mean? Because they've literally been like pushing this throw their whole entire life. So talk a little bit about that, how you kind of try to get to that point.
Couple things that we definitely focus on. One is the ability to create like a jab step. I think a lot of guys naturally swing the feet, replace the feet. Usually what we see from guys that do that, like it's too lateral with the back foot, like they're swinging it out too far, as they end up crossing their body when they come back to throw, right? And so at that point, you're almost in a position where, you know, you're closed off. You're definitely going to be pulling your spine out. You're definitely going to be probably over slotted at the top, like from way too high. We're cutting the ball. So like really the ability to create that jab step and get it down in the middle of your body. Not saying that everybody ends up throwing that way, but like just having that control of the back foot so that we can get ourselves, you know, in the lane that we want, regardless of where the feet is. The second thing, and probably to your point on just being able to get the ball out front, like if we're doing any competitions, if we're tracking any data, like we will not count throws where you finish in front of the plate. So like if you do get too extended with that first step, or you're like just taking your body way too far forward and you're ending up out in front of the plate, like we don't count it. You got to be able to post up and finish your throw behind the plate. And just giving guys that constraint in general seems to really clean up a lot of it and make it more rotational, get the hips doing what we want. I think the biggest issue with the arm slot stuff is, you know, for probably as long as I can remember in this game, we've been telling catchers, man, you really got to get on top of it. You got to pull it down, right? And so I think it promotes a lot of the stuff we just talked about that we actually don't want, right? Cool. I don't want you bending your spine halfway to the on deck circle just so you can create a slot up here. I like look at all of them, man. Look at Posey, look at Yachty, look at Contreras, look at Hedges, like look at some of the best throwers in the game, Real Muto, like, dude, we're here.
And it goes back too. Like those people like old school. Like I got videos of Pudge, like legit, like you know, like lower than 3/4. Like I mean, it's unbelievable, and he's throwing it better than anybody did. You know.
Yeah. No. 100%. So, you know, for that, there's obviously a lot of like athletic catch play, throws on the run, a lot of different arm slots and angles. You know, with the academy kids that we have that we get to see, you know, kind of throughout the week multiple times, like we mix them into the infield group all the time, like go turn some double plays, go just, once again, explore with it, because you trying to put yourself in this position every single throw ever, not going to work for you. And we know this, like we know that, you know, the best throw, the highest probability out at second base does not come right over the bag. It's going to come 2 to 4 feet up the line. Like if we can get some two seam run, that's probably advantageous for us. So, you know, we definitely haven't figured it out and gotten everybody there. But really just kind of getting them outside of that traditional mold and that thought process of like, oh, I got to get up here and really pull that thing down. That's definitely been helpful.
the over the top thing that's definitely a detriment. And I think it kind of goes back to like we're talking about with younger ages, like just let guys throw and let them be natural and figure out where they throw from. And, the best thing to happen to us, we're local here, but like Patrick Bailey has been the best example of like, dude, when his left foot hits the ground, whatever his spine angle's at, he's rotating on that. And that's where his arm angle is going to be, like, period, and so just trying to get guys to understand, like, the minute your left foot hits the ground, we have to rotate. And I think I'm happy to hear you say this because a lot of times guys do talk about the right foot getting behind the left. And I'm really not a fan of that because it promotes more of a swing than like the actual like explosion of the hips up. So I think guys are slower. But then if my right foot goes to my left, like my upper body is going to balance it out. So like if my upper body's now like this, like I now have to take time to go like this. And now I've moved forward, 18 inches in that period of time. I've tried to realign myself and I lost that release point. And that's where Bailey's so good is like, if he's like this, well, then he's throwing from, way down here because that's where he's rotating on that thing. So I love hearing that. But like the release point, I mean, we've just been doing a lot more. I mean, we intro like rotation, like we put like a stability pad on their left foot and just be like, just push against this and throw. And that's where they really start to be like, feels more of like that slingshot. And they're like, oh, wow, that's like awesome. I'm like, okay, yes, that's awesome. But I've started you here. How do we get to this position to allow you to do that is the toughest piece, right? We got a pitch coming, the runner's running. This is the most adrenaline packed play in baseball. Nobody else it's like has action moving before the play happens. It's just so much, right? Yeah. So getting them to control it. But we started just doing more long hops. Like, hey, let's just throw long hops because you're going to get an extension when you throw that thing down. And, even more so as we're seeing guys in the big leagues, like we had Craig Driver on here. He talked about how Real Muto loves to use the long hop and found a video of Sean Murphy throwing like 10 long hops. And I look it up. I'm like, dude, those guys literally averaged Real Muto averaged 85 miles an hour and Murphy averaged 84 miles an hour on their throws. I'm like, and you guys, you 13-year-olds, you think you're too cool to long hop it?
Yeah. When you're on 66.
Exactly. It's like, go ahead and do that. And then again, we're down in the tag zone when the ball gets there, which is another piece that's not talked about enough. I feel like just that idea of like, let's cut down the tag time. That's the third piece of this whole thing.
Yeah. I remember, I don't know if it's on Savant, but they have like a whole StatCast throwing breakdown now that you can look at, and it'll literally credit each party involved on like, who was this stolen base on? And it might've been when we were looking at Will Smith's from, a couple years back, his throwing numbers weren't great, but like you look at all these throws and the guy had like nothing to do with the fact that those runners were safe. He was making great throws. Mm-hmm. Infielder's not there or pitcher's too long to the plate or whatever it is. It's like, dude, if the catcher's only responsible on a given throw for, 8% of whether or not this guy's out, not much you can do anyways, But to your point, yes, I used to be super biased against never bouncing the ball to second, especially for amateurs. Generally because at the time in recruiting, it's like, oh, first thing I see is like, this kid can't get the ball to second base, like cross that name off the list kind of thing, right? I'd rather see backspin it into center field. Hey, he's got an arm. I can work with that,
Mm-hmm.
With the evolution of the game and especially with the throwing piece and everything we've seen in the last few years, like we're definitely kind of on the same thing as you with being able to long hop the ball and utilize the ground. And yes, it helps us put more balls in the tag zone. But I think just getting those guys athletic and like you said, understanding that like, dude, foot's down, we got to go. And we've got to be open to being able to get to different arm slots and really work around our spine. It's a huge thing. So
for sure. I think another shout out to Eugene Bleeker because we've started pimping the finish with the catchers. Mm-hmm. I mean, dude, talk about a insane deal, dude. Like seriously, I'm watching him talk about pitchers and how when they pimp the finish, like, man, dude, like the one thing I have a hard time with catchers is like getting them to be behind their front side,
Yeah.
So like I have one kid and I'm like, I'm like, hey, just pimp the finish on these ones, right? We got these like little orange targets, on the thing. And
Yeah.
like, at the time he's thinking like, oh, I'm doing a pimp that's drill, like, my velocity is probably going to jump because I'm going to be throwing it harder, right? And like, I'm not kidding, 8 in a row, he just goes bah 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 and hit this target like this big 8 times in a row. And he's like 4 or 5 in, he's like laughing. He's like, what the fuck's going on right now? Like he didn't even like realize, like he's like, dude, this is insane. Like I feel like you just have like a magic trick. And I'm like, no, dude, you're behind your front side, so you are able to get to the release point that you need to, and that's what we have to do. Like, dude, we can throw so good, just any human throw if we have the space to throw. Like if it's there, we're gonna get to the points we get to, right? It's just a matter of like we don't get there enough.
Yeah.
So that one to me, I don't know if you've mixed in a lot of that, but like guys are like literally like decelerating the arm after release. Like we're like seeing guys like accelerate through release. Whereas
Mhm.
like a lot of guys that you see will kind of just like hold the finish here. And we used to talk about that a lot, like holding that right
Oh yeah.
shoulder over the left foot.
Put
And
it in
that's
the
like,
Oh yeah.
yeah. And I think it helped a lot of guys, but it's the idea of like, well, if I'm stopping here, like I had to slow down somewhere in here. So like there's a point where like I might have been slowing down literally as I was releasing the ball. Now when the deceleration is on the way back, that recoil, they're
Yeah.
just like ripping through. But then mostly like they're almost like lifting up off the left foot. They're so behind it. Like they're like pushing up off the left foot and creating that. Have you mixed any of that stuff in?
Dude, we do it all the time.
Love it.
All the time. We do it with obviously with our catchers when they're throwing. Uh, we've got our infielders doing it on like double play turns and feeds and stuff like that. We do it with
So
our hitters,
good.
and it's like, dude, if just the simple concept of like a destination cue, right? Like if we really prioritize where we want to get to at the end of this, and we know that, oh, I got to pimp this finish, or oh, I've got to do this in my swing, and I want to feel this at the end of it. Crazy how everything in the middle cleans up, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think with the way that so many kids are coached and cued, and the experience they generally get in a training environment or a practice environment, it's so process oriented. It's so focused on what happens at the beginning that like whatever happens afterwards, like they haven't spent a second thinking about, right? And so like their whole process is now me manipulating the process, like
Mm-hmm.
just getting the destination cue, make it fun, make it super competitive, high intent, weird, everything in the middle kind of cleaned up. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, we do use that frequently across multiple departments, and probably had the same thoughts and successes with it that you've had.
It reminds me of a video Andy McKay at the coaches convention. Probably over a decade ago now, but he had this video of Tiger Woods, and he's like literally talking about how he's like, there's times I'm there, and this is like 2000 Tiger, like just in the zone, and like he's like, there's times I like address the ball, and I remember addressing the ball, and I like remember where I finished, and like I honestly don't even like remember the swing, like
Yeah,
because it's just like so programmed in him, and he's got such his mental capacity of like, I'm just hitting this. And you said it just right with the idea of like, we gotta, like the stuff in the middle, we gotta stop talking about the stuff in the middle a lot. We're like kind of talking too much about getting to this point and that point and that point. It's like, are we at a good place to start, and then try to finish here, and can kind of get us where we need to. And I think you're a golfer like I am. There's so many times where I'm like, dude, just I got to hit this one higher. Just finish higher. Don't try to do, like instead of like I flipped my hands because I was like really trying to like hit it. No, just finish. Just get to this point now. You know what I mean?
dude. Well, speaking of Tiger, there was a thing that Golf Digest used to do. They'd get guys out on the range. They'd ask them a couple questions, challenge them with some different things or whatever. And I'm sitting there, I'm watching every episode, like trying to figure out how to golf. And when they would ask about like draws and cuts, like how do you hit it? How do you hit it? Everybody has this technical approach of like, oh well, I line up here, I do this, and then I swing down this line. And Tiger eventually gets onto the show, and they said, "What do you do to hit a draw?" He's like, "I finish lower." Like, what do you do to hit a cut? I finish higher. That's it.
Yeah.
Like I try to finish up here for this one. I try to finish here for this one. And was like, oh man, that makes a lot of sense, you know?
He's insane, dude. There's some of those like tailor-made videos they did, where like it's like him and Rory and Jason Day, and they're like chipping, and Jason Day's like, what are you thinking about here? And he's like, I'm just feeling it in my hands. And
Yeah.
like Jason Day's like, could you just talk like a normal golfer? Like, dude, come on, man. Like, he's just like upset, but it's like, but he is the perfect example of he changed the game in how he brought power to it, right? Like he's the first guy that was like, I'm gonna swing as hard as I can, I'm gonna hit it down there as far as I can. But yet he had the greatest feel of anybody who's ever played the game. And so it's like people think of like it's kind of like the launch angle argument versus like figuring out how to get hits. Like, oh, when I do it like this, like that's great, but just like in golf, like, oh, I can bomb the drive. That's awesome. But like when you got 87 yards into the wind, and you got a back pin, like, do you have some feel for that? And
Yeah.
it's the same thing. It's like, oh, great. When you're perfect, you're bang, you hit this ball 400 feet. That's cool. What about the changeup? Like now they're going to throw it down and away. You know what I mean? And that's the idea of like the feel piece. And that's the same thing we're doing with catchers of just trying to get them like, we got to feel way more than talk. And like you said, I think having, video data, something that gets them to connect the feel of what that is instead of when I move my body this way. No, just like have a different thought and a different feel to it.
Yeah. And you could honestly, we could pull it up and run through it. And I've done it before, and I'm sure it's still as true as ever. When we get kids really focus on the right things, right? Especially in regards to destination cues, pimp the finish, get to your finish, whatever it is. Hey, let's bring more intensity into this rep, right? Like I want you to go PR. I want you to go do this. Those are the swings and those are the things that you see in the Twitterverse where people are like, oh man, that's a hit track swing that doesn't play in a game. Oh man, that's not going to work. That exchange time doesn't work when there's a runner stealing. But it's like generally what we see when we get guys more intentional with what they're doing, bringing more intensity and focused on the right parts of it, whether it's that finish or whatever that destination cue is, everything in the middle actually gets a lot better. Oh man, you were on plane a lot longer there. Oh man, you accelerated your barrel way earlier there. Oh man, you matched the pitch plane way better there, whatever it is. Catchers, oh, we have way more adjustability all of a sudden. We're handling different parts of the zone. Oh man, you just threw, the best throw you've made all night, and then you did it 5 more times or 8 more times and hit the target, right? Like we do see the totality of everything getting better when they're cued the right way, focused on the right things, and kind of letting it eat. How many kids go through a training session and never even come close to doing anything 100%?
Mm-hmm.
And then we throw them in a game and we expect to be able to do something 100%. So,
And it's a tough, when you have guys for a long period of time, it becomes difficult because like, it's like we were talking about earlier. Like when I first get guys, like I want to teach them how to throw the ball hard from the position. So I'm not as concerned about how quickly they get rid of it. It's like, we got to get you to figure out how to throw the ball hard. And then it might be 2 years later that it's like, dude, get that thing out as fast as you possibly can. And so the processes change and the cues change as we develop. And again, I think it goes to the idea of like, there's no absolutes, right? We're like, everybody wants to say like, oh, this is how you teach this. And this is no, like what we're teaching 13-year-olds is not what we're teaching 16-year-olds, not what we're teaching, 26-year-olds. And I just don't think people have enough understanding of processes, and they really feel like that's where it's like, like people, even like parents will kind of be like, oh, so like how often do they come in and like how long do they do it for? And I'm like, well, they come in every week and they do it, until they leave, for college. Like if they really care, you know what I mean? Because the reality is like, we got to get the reps in, period. But like, again, like I'm going to be teaching him more along the way, but we got to get past this step and this step and this step. And then we keep on progressing through it.
For sure. I mean, for starters, like the game's evolving, right? And more so with what we're seeing with catching, even with hitting, like the game's evolving. And so whatever we were working on 5 years ago, I'd hope that we're working on something new and better and more efficient now, right? Pitchers are going to be attacking us differently than they were 5 years ago, whether that's from a defensive standpoint as a catcher or offensively as a hitter. But development is a long game. And on the amateur side, which is what you and I probably deal with the majority of the time, that's not how it's seen. It's like, hey, Johnny's got that showcase this weekend. What can we do to get his pop times down? Well, dude, it's Wednesday night. There's probably not a whole lot we can do by Saturday.
Well, what's he going to eat for breakfast?
Yeah, you know. And to your point, like the things that we're asking these kids to do within the context of catching, which there's 3 entirely different skill sets there altogether, physically, right? Like we got to receive, we got to block, we got to throw, or hitting, right? There's different components to that. If you're going to hyper focus on something, right? If we've deemed something as hey, this is what's really important, especially maybe with where you're at now, your age, your physicality, or whatever, we're going to definitely attack this piece of it. You're probably not going to attack the other pieces because you're hyper focused on one, right? Taking this holistic approach of like, we're going to attack everything all the time, all together. That's not how it works. And so there's a time and place for that, for sure, within the realm of training environments and how we acquire patterns. But like anytime you hyper focus on one thing, you're going to take focus away from it somewhere else. And that could be the best thing for a kid, because right now with where your body's at and where your game's at and whatever level you're playing at, maybe you don't need to be focusing on this so much, right? The kid that comes in who's a phenomenal blocker but really doesn't understand the nuances of his setup and his transitions and his glove load and his receiving, like, yeah, we're probably not going to touch the blocking. Let's go focus on this over here. And it sucks because that's not always what parents want to see or have been trained to value. But it is the long game. And that's how the best players in the world are getting after it. And that's what the best organizations in sports are doing with their player development. Like, they're taking their time with it and they have a plan.
Thanks for tuning in. As mentioned before, this is a 2-part episode. Be sure to check back in a couple weeks where we dive even deeper with Brandon about the training that they're doing with all their amateur athletes. If you enjoyed that, be sure to like and subscribe. We'll have a new episode for you every single Tuesday here on our YouTube channel and wherever you listen to podcasts.